For those who don't know, I'm Mark Lutter. I founded the Charter Cities Institute about 6 years ago. Having seen people working on kind of innovative governance on new city projects, but without much communication between the different stakeholders. For example, when I was in graduate school, I went to work on advise a new city project in Kazakhstan briefly, and they invited distinguished urban planners from MIT who were unaware that zoning and land use will cause housing prices to increase. And so there just wasn't a lot of communication between these different stakeholders, and the Charter Cities Institute was founded to address that, and this is the culmination of many, many years of work. I'd like to thank Curtis for taking over and doing a better job than I was doing about 2 years ago, and actually pulling off the conference that I've been talking about for a few years that COVID interrupted. And then additionally, I'd like to thank, and I'm sorry, I'm probably going to mispronounce your name, Gemma, who stepped in when Michael Holstein, unfortunately, was unable to attend and is shouldering a lot of the logistical burden of the conference, as well as the CCI team generally. I mean, this is like an awesome stage, so we should be very happy with that. So as Curtis was saying, right, the opportunity is now. Africa is urbanizing now, and I think it's imperative to figure out how to implement these solutions now. Why is that? We're in humanity's final wave of urbanization, and it's much easier to implement these reforms before the urbanization happens than after, right? Once you have a city that exists, once you have sprawling slums with poor infrastructure, with all of these interest groups, it is very difficult to reform that, to improve public transportation, to improve governance. If you look at France, for example, the France that we know today required a dictator, Napoleon III, to come in and say, Housemen, go bulldoze entire city blocks and build that, right? That is not a good thing. You want to build those solutions in from the beginning to allow for effective transportation networks, to allow for good governance, to allow for human flourishing to emerge. And figuring out how to do it as the urbanization is happening, before the urbanization happens, I think is really critical to achieving these effective solutions. So I think one of the challenges that we face today is urbanization without industrialization. Historically, urbanization has been tied to industrialization and productivity gains. People would move to cities, they would develop more specialized skills, they would become more productive, they would make more money, their kids would make more money, etc. This is kind of a classic story in America where you have the immigrant or the small town person who moves to a city, they have some dingy job, right, working in a sweatshop, slowly work their way up over time to build a better life for themselves and their children. I think a lot of the challenge is in cities in Africa and the Middle East today is that story no longer is as true as it used to be. There's urbanization, there's increasing percentages of a population living in urban centers without the industrialization and productivity gains that have historically accompanied that urbanization. And so one of the key questions is, how do we create the frameworks? How do we empower these people, empower these urban centers to improve productivity over time, to create the wealth that they and their children can then live better lives with? And as previously mentioned, this is also critical because of the overwhelming youth population. As the population increases, ensuring that these people have education opportunities, have job opportunities, I think is really critical, not just to Africa's future, but to humanity's future. So what to do? At the Charter Cities Institute, we kind of think about some historical examples that I think offer a framework within which new cities can be meaningful, charter cities can be meaningful. This isn't to say that these are one-to-one examples, right? These have unique historical contexts that allowed them to be successful, but there still are some general learnings that we can take from them that we can use to frame the discussion around new cities, around charter cities. So right, Singapore, it has the dubious distinction of being perhaps the only country in the world that did not want to be a country. After gaining independence, they merged with Malaysia, and Malaysia kicked them out because of differences in the vision of what the future should be, right? After they were kicked out in 1965, there were widespread ethnic riots. believe it was in 1969, maybe 71, the British withdrew a port there that provided 17% of Singapore's entire economy. Right? Today, Singapore, when Westworld wants to shoot LA in 50 years in the future, they go to Singapore to shoot it. Right? It's a city from the future. It achieved that in part because of natural advantages. On the Malacca Strait, it has a access to a large trade route. It benefited from Asia and China's general rise, but it also benefited from understanding where it was, understanding how to partner with different countries, with different governments, how to empower the local population, how to attract capital. And these lessons, I think, are applicable more broadly. You also have Hong Kong, right? Hong Kong emerged from World War II, a devastated Japanese colony. The population had dropped probably over 50%. In the 6 years from 1945 to 1951, the population increased by over 1 million people in just a 6-year period, right? The first few decades after World War II, there was very little public infrastructure spending because the government really wanted to ensure that they were a net capital contributor to the UK budget, not a net capital negative amount. There's a better word for that. And so that they also show, right, Singapore was more state-directed capitalism. Hong Kong was a much more libertarian version of capitalism, benefiting from economic migrants from Shanghai. Then Dubai, a similar story, right? Like 50 years ago, about when they gained independence from the UK, their quality of life indicators were comparable to a war zone today. Life expectancy was in the mid-50s. Literacy, I think, was below 50. The number of college graduates could probably be counted on a hand or two. And now it's a global city, an entrepot for the region. And they achieved that through targeted infrastructure investment combined with legal and regulatory regimes that were attractive to regional and global traders and investors. Now, we can also look at China, which arguably provides the best illustration of the power of urbanization and special economic zones. China's economic growth, I think, can be fairly treated as the result of high degrees of urbanization combined with special economic zones to decentralize decision-making and allow for smaller jurisdictions to be more receptive to changes on the ground. The best example of this is Shenzhen, right? After Mao died, Deng Xiaoping realized, okay, look, we need to develop, we need to attract investment, we need to industrialize. But he didn't know exactly how to do it. His famous quote, crossing the river by feeling the stones with our feet, underlaid their entire development strategy. Another interesting anecdote is that Deng Xiaoping went to Singapore where he met Lee Kuan Yew and noticed, hey, these Chinese people in Singapore, they're merchants, they're traders, they're middle class. But he could tell from their last names that in China they had been peasants. So this made him think, okay, if in a better institutional environment, if in a better regulatory environment, people in China who are peasants can become middle class in Singapore, maybe we can figure out how to create that institutional environment in China. The example of this is Shenzhen. It's often called a special economic zone, but it was much more than that. The Chinese government devolved authority to Shenzhen, basically almost everything, with the slight exception of things like the rail service, the post office, etc. But almost everything else was decided upon by the Shenzhen city government. Second, unlike many special economic zones today, which are a few hundred acres, maybe a few square kilometers, Shenzhen was 320 square kilometers from the beginning. It was a city-scale project. Third is just the location and proximity. Shenzhen was chosen as opposed to Shanghai because Shanghai was the traditional commercial center of China, and the Communist Party did not want to empower capitalists. But Shenzhen, because it was a relative backwater compared to Shanghai, was allowed to experiment with policies. And this experimentation benefited greatly from its proximity to Hong Kong. There were a lot of cultural and familial relationships that allowed for quick knowledge as well as capital transfer to Shenzhen to allow them to take advantage of rising labor costs in Hong Kong and begin creating a manufacturing center. So Shenzhen is effectively the start of Chinese economic growth urbanization. Within 4 years, they had the tallest building in all of China. They pioneered labor markets that were later adopted by all of China. They pioneered land markets that were later adopted throughout China. They pioneered capital markets that were later adopted throughout China. As you can see, they experienced astonishing economic growth with that. Right? This trend of figuring out, okay, how do we create jurisdictions that cater to the local needs of the population? How do we create an enabling environment that can lead to investment, that can lead to productivity growth, that can lead to economic growth spread throughout the rest of China? There was a wave of urbanization and special economic zones that was modeled on the initial 4 in 1980, primarily on Shenzhen. You saw this graph of the increasing urban population of the world, primarily occurring in the global south. And what I see this conference as, we have a lot of different stakeholders at the table, people who are working on new cities, on charter city-esque projects, on special jurisdictions. But given the scale of the challenge and the opportunity we face, what I see as critical is how do we create a community? How do we create a network? How do we learn from each other? What works in one scenario? How do we test that in another scenario? If something works, how do we scale it up? How do we attract more capital for these projects? How do we partner with governments more effectively, right? Individually, we can do a little bit. I think together, as a community, as a network, we can create this iterative learning process that can allow us to be much more effective in tackling the opportunity of rapid urbanization in Africa.